Certainly. Let's delve deeper into the story of Mercy Brown, exploring not only the events but also the cultural context, the people involved, and the lasting impact of this macabre chapter in American history. In the late 19th century, New England was a region gripped by fear, not of supernatural entities but of a disease that was ravaging families and communities, tuberculosis, TB. Known colloquially as consumption, TB was the leading cause of death in the United States during this time, particularly in rural areas where medical knowledge was limited and the spread of disease was not well understood. Tuberculosis is a bacterial infection caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, primarily affecting the lungs but capable of spreading to other parts of the body. It was called consumption because the disease seemed to consume the infected person, causing severe weight loss, chronic coughing, often with blood, night sweats, and fatigue. The death was usually slow and agonizing, leading to its association with dark, supernatural forces. With the absence of effective medical treatments, people turned to superstition and folklore to explain the devastation caused by TB. In rural New England, where communities were often isolated and traditional beliefs held sway, the idea of the vampire emerged as a way to rationalize why one family member after another might fall ill and die. In these communities, it was believed that the dead could rise from their graves to drain the life force from their living relatives. These vampires were not like the blood-drinking creatures of modern fiction but rather the restless dead who, through their connection to the living, continue to spread death from beyond the grave. Exeter, Rhode Island, was a small, rural community in the late 1800s. It was a place where everyone knew each other, and families were deeply interconnected. The Brown family was one such family, a modest, hard-working clan who lived on a small farm and were respected members of the community. The patriarch of the family, George Brown, was a farmer who worked the land to provide for his wife and children. He was known to be a practical and stoic man, not prone to flights of fancy or superstition. However, his life would be marked by an almost unimaginable string of tragedies. George's wife, Mary Eliza, was the first in the family to fall victim to tuberculosis. She was a strong woman, well regarded in the community, but in 1883, she succumbed to the disease after a long and painful struggle. Her death was a devastating blow to the family, leaving George to raise their children alone. Following her mother's death, the eldest daughter, Mary Olive, began showing symptoms of tuberculosis. Mary Olive was only 20 years old when she died in 1886. Her death, like her mother's, was slow and painful, and it cast a long shadow over the family. Mary Olive was described as a sweet and loving girl, and her passing was deeply mourned by those who knew her. The only son, Edwin, was next to fall ill. He had been a healthy and strong young man, but soon after his sister's death, he began to show the telltale signs of tuberculosis. In an attempt to cure him, George sent Edwin to Colorado Springs, Colorado, a place renowned for its clean air and therapeutic climate. However, despite this effort, Edwin's condition only worsened, and he eventually returned home to Exeter, still gravely ill. The youngest daughter, Mercy Lena Brown, was a bright and vivacious girl known for her strong will. However, in 1891, she too contracted tuberculosis. Unlike her mother and sister, who suffered from the disease over a prolonged period, Mercy's case was acute. She quickly became bedridden and died on January 17, 1892, at the age of 19. Due to the harsh winter conditions, Mercy's body was placed in the family crypt, a small above-ground tomb, rather than being buried immediately. This delay in her burial would become a key factor in the events that followed. With the death of Mercy, the Brown family had been almost entirely wiped out by tuberculosis. Only George and his son Edwin remained. Edwin's health was rapidly deteriorating, and the community began to whisper about the possibility of a supernatural cause for the family's misfortunes. The belief that a recently deceased family member could be responsible for the continued illness of the living was deeply rooted in New England folklore. Stories of vampires were not uncommon, particularly in rural areas where superstition held sway over reason. The idea was that the dead, particularly those who died of a wasting disease like tuberculosis, might become undead, rising from their graves to feed on the life essence of their kind. In the case of the Brown family, the community began to suspect that one of the deceased family members, Mary Eliza, Mary Olive, or Mercy, was a vampire and was draining the life from Edwin. These suspicions were fueled by the persistent nature of the illness that had claimed so many of the Browns. As Edwin's condition worsened, George Brown found himself under increasing pressure from his neighbors and friends. They believed that the only way to save Edwin was to identify and destroy the vampire within his family. Reluctantly, George agreed to the exhumation of his deceased relatives, hoping that this drastic measure might save his son. On March 17, 1892, a group of local villagers, along with a doctor, gathered at the Chestnut Hill Cemetery in Exeter to exhume the bodies of Mary Eliza, Mary Olive, and Mercy Brown. This event was not only a desperate attempt to save Edwin but also a reflection of the deep-seated fears and superstitions that gripped the community. The bodies of Mary Eliza and Mary Olive, who had been buried for several years, were exhumed first. As expected, their bodies were found to be in an advanced state of decomposition, consistent with the length of time they had been in the ground. There was no sign of anything unusual, and so attention turned to Mercy. Mercy's body was the last to be examined. Because she had been buried only a few months earlier and kept in a cold, above-ground crypt, her body was in a much better state of preservation. To the villagers, this was a clear sign that something was amiss. They noted that her body appeared fresh, with little decomposition. When they examined her heart, they found that it still contained liquid blood, a detail that would prove crucial in their minds. The discovery of liquid blood in Mercy's heart was taken as proof that she was the vampire responsible for Edwin's illness. Following the customs of the time, the villagers removed her heart and liver from her body. These organs were taken to a nearby rock and burned to ashes. The belief was that by destroying the heart of the vampire, they could break the supernatural hold she had on Edwin. After burning Mercy's heart, the ashes were mixed with water to create a concoction known as a medicine. This potion was given to Edwin to drink, in the hope that it would cure him of the consumption that was slowly killing him. Unfortunately, despite this desperate act, Edwin's health continued to decline, and he died on May 2, 1892, just a few months after the exhumation. The exhumation of Mercy Brown and the burning of her heart marked one of the last recorded cases of vampire hysteria in New England. The event received widespread attention, both locally and internationally, as newspapers reported on the bizarre and tragic events in Exeter. The story of Mercy Brown quickly spread beyond Rhode Island. Newspapers in Boston and New York picked up the tale, often sensationalizing the events and painting the people of Exeter as backward and superstitious. The idea that vampire beliefs could still hold sway in 19th-century America fascinated and horrified people, highlighting the tension between old-world superstitions and the emerging scientific understanding of disease. Over the years, the legend of Mercy Brown has been retold in various forms. Her story has appeared in books, documentaries, and even as an inspiration for fictional works. Mercy Brown is sometimes referred to as America's last vampire, symbolizing the end of an era where fear of the unknown led to drastic and gruesome actions. Her case is often cited in discussions about the intersection of folklore and disease, illustrating how communities in crisis can turn to supernatural explanations when faced with overwhelming fear and loss. Today, the story of Mercy Brown is seen as a poignant reminder of the power of superstition and the human need to make sense of tragedy. While we now understand that tuberculosis is caused by a bacterium and can be treated with antibiotics, the story of Mercy Brown shows how, in the absence of scientific knowledge, people will grasp at any explanation that offers hope, even if it involves the unthinkable. The Brown family's grave site in Exeter has become a place of interest for those fascinated by the macabre and the supernatural. Visitors often leave small tokens on Mercy's grave, and the site is sometimes included in tours of haunted New England. The legend of Mercy Brown is a tale of tragedy, fear, and the desperate lengths to which people will go when faced with an invisible enemy. It's a story that underscores the profound impact of disease on communities and the ways in which folklore and superstition can fill the gaps left by a lack of scientific understanding. Mercy Brown's story is more than just a vampire legend. It is a window into a time when death was an ever-present reality, and people sought to protect their loved ones by any means necessary, even if those means were rooted in ancient and terrifying beliefs.